This e-lecture will cover Chapter 8 in your textbook, which is going to discuss later sessions, finding, amplifying, and measuring client progress. Let's get started. So after you've initially met with that client for the very first session, and as you've continued to work with them several sessions out, how you work with them differs just a bit from that very first session and how that works out. And so just keep in mind that as you continue to work with them, you're inviting client to amplify those exceptions, those times when that problem was supposed to happen or maybe should have happened and it didn't, or when the problem was less severe. So continue inviting that discussion and that dialogue, as well as use scaling to help measure your progress. In later sessions, this is how we measure progress. And we use that to help us gauge as far as what the client, where they currently may be and where they would like to be. And so use that along with additional goal formulation. And then deliver feedback. Just like we've done in previous sessions, you're going to continue to do that every session so that you can provide feedback based on what content and what was discussed in that immediate session. So this is just a general template of what happens in later sessions, and we're going to dive in a little deeper of what that looks like. So how do you begin later sessions? Obviously, you don't start off those later sessions like you did the very first, where you do names and you may clarify how you work still, and you may still do small talk because it is nice to still ease the client into session, but it's with a slightly different intention. Whereas in the beginning, it may have been because you didn't know each other and you were trying to ease that piece. For small talk for future sessions, the intention behind it is just to help ease the client back into session, and then you ease them out of session. And so how do you begin later sessions in general, though? When they come back to you and you've already discussed this problem and you've already discussed solutions and they've given you exceptions, how do you start that off? Ask this wonderful two-word question: what's better? What is better? Why do we ask this instead of, did you follow our suggestion? Or maybe, is anything better? I mean, maybe it wasn't better, so maybe we should err on the side of caution and instead ask, is anything better? Or if we gave them a really great suggestion in the previous session, then we should probably follow up first with finding out if they did it, right? So what are the reasons why we don't ask these other ways and instead we ask what's better? First things is that we don't view those suggestions that we offer at the end of each session, we don't view those as the solutions to all of our clients' problems. Take in mind that even though the suggestions pull from what the client has given us already, so it's not our advice, it still may not be the end-all be-all. It may not be the magic solution that they forgot that they knew how to do. So we don't view that as the big discovery that the client has had to implement in their lives. And so because we don't view it that way, we don't need to necessarily follow up and find out if they did it. Also, we avoid putting us into that awkward position of, did you do our suggestion that we discussed last week? And then if a client didn't, then they have to feel like they have to disappoint you, and they might say, well, no, I didn't, and they have to justify and explain the reasons why, and then you feel awkward because now you see your client getting very uncomfortable, and it just makes it a very awkward situation. And often clients will go beyond what that suggestion may be. So maybe the suggestion was just a simple observational piece, and the client took it a step further and actually did some behavioral pieces involved as well. So we don't want to limit to just what the suggestion was. We want to open it up and just find out what happened. And so this is an open-ended way of starting off session, not assuming that certain things had to be done, but instead asking and finding out what was done. And that's why we use the question, what's better? And let the client tell us what's better. We also want to make sure that by not asking, is anything better, that's a closed question. So saying, is anything better, the client can say no. And there's the end of that conversation. But what we do want to do is assume that there will be something better. We're solution-focused therapists, and solution-focused therapists are perpetually optimistic, which means is that there's got to be something that was better that happened this past week, and I want to hear about it. And when we come in with that perspective, that we assume that something's got to be better, you'll be amazed at how the clients start to take on that, and they start to actually try to find those positive pieces as well. So, begin your later sessions asking, what's better? EARS, a wonderful little acronym that helps give perspective of the process as you get into later sessions. So do you remember what they stand for? It might be very important for you to know what they are. The E stands for eliciting the exception. So finding out. Elicit means to find out more information about that exception, to gain information, to dig deeper. And so we continue session after session to ask more about those exception times that may have happened this past week or that have happened in the past few weeks. So elicit what those exceptions may be, and then once we find out what they are, we amplify it. We say, well, what's different, or how did that happen? How did he make that happen? Those are the things that we want to amplify and really bring to the forefront so our clients can realize, wow, I really did make that happen. That is kind of a neat thing, isn't it? So we amplify it. R is reinforcing those successes and strengths, so being able to reinforce, complement the strengths that the client brings, their successes that they've attained thus far. And then S, you start again with, again, what else is better. And so this is a little cycle that you can use to remind yourself the process when you're discussing exceptions and when you're processing this with your clients. So you elicit the exception, you amplify the exception, you reinforce successes and strengths, and then you start again. And that is what EARS stands for. So goal formulation in later sessions. In your very first session, you used that beautiful miracle question that helped you paint the canvas. However, because a miracle question is such a unique question, we don't want to make it lose its efficacy or if its pizzazz, so to speak, by asking it repetitively in future sessions. Besides it losing its luster, the clients might start to think that you may not have any other questions in your arsenal there that you can use to be able to find out more information and to help with goal formation. So we don't want to overuse that. That's why we pretty much use the miracle question for the first session. And then we use all of those other goal formulation questions that we discussed in Chapter 5. We continue to use those throughout all upcoming sessions. So only the miracle question is reserved for that very first session, and then everything else we continue to use for other sessions. So instead of using the miracle question, we use things like scaling so that we can assess what the goals are and what the client would like that to be and to paint that picture. So it's a different tool, but we're still painting the canvas so that we have a very clear perception of what the client's goals are. So let's say your client says that he's at a 6 on the miracle scale. So when comparing to the miracle day, because we still use that information from that miracle day, but he says he's at a 6 on that miracle scale. And he wants to be at a 9. That's his goal. He thinks that once he gets to a 9, he will no longer have to come see you. You want to continue to ask, and I mentioned this briefly when we discussed scaling a few lectures back, but you want to be able to ask, what's going to be different? If you're at a 6 now, what does a 6 mean? What does that look like to you? And then what's going to be different when you're at a 7? Or when you're at an 8? Or when you're there and you've achieved your goal and you're at a 9? Why we do this incrementally is that we want to be able to get a tangible sense of what the differences may be on that scale piece. And so while I don't want you to ask the question one right after another, so that you ask what's going to be different at 7, what's going to be different at 8, because that's going to lose also momentum. But figure out what's going to be most helpful right now. Maybe you're just curious about what a 7 looks like compared to a 6, because your client might not be quite at the point of really being able to discuss what a 9 looks like. Or maybe you want to just jump straight up to the 9 and say, well, what's going to be different between a 6 where you are currently and when you're at a 9? How will you know you are at a 9? And by asking those questions and using that tangible scale, we can really get more detail and have more definition of what those goals are for that client. So goal formulation takes place after you've explored what's been better. So you might spend the first 30 minutes, the first 20 minutes of your session just discussing what has been better this past week for your client and finding out all those exceptions that happened and all those positive things that may have resulted from your client's situation. Once we get to that point, then we can bring up the scaling and ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being that miracle day, where would you say you are now? And then discussing where would they like to be. So that's one way of being able to use scaling to continue to develop and assess goals. And then when it comes to termination, how do you know when it's time to let your client go and for them to let you go, when your work is done? And with solution-focused therapy, because a client is the expert, we really empower them to help provide us with that information. So a question that you can ask is, what needs to be different in your life as a result of coming here for you to say that meeting with me was worthwhile? So this is another way of you getting information of what is the bottom line. What are they wanting out of this whole experience? that will tell them that it was a success. What number on the scale do you need to be at in order to feel that you no longer need to come and talk to me anymore? That's another way of using the scaling question while being able to discuss termination. We want to involve our clients in the termination discussion because it helps them to be invested